All right. So thanks for having me. Just to go back to IWTO, I wasn't actually going to say anything about it, but I did speak at IWTO. When was that? 2016. And I have to say, at least from my personal experience, it is definitely an event not to be missed. I'm not like really trying to tell you anything about it, but like it's consistently the one women's event that I go to where I tear up. It gets to me emotionally. It's something I care about. So yeah, just a little mini plug for that. And also specifically to the men in the room, I still find that I go to a lot of women events where it is still only 98% women in attendance. And I really don't feel like we're actually passing that area of having proper discussions because there aren't men to actually talk to. So as much as you feel like it seems weird to be going to a women's event, please don't like show up. We're normal. I swear. Even if you are crying. So on to another topic that's really close to my heart, which is actually growing and developing product teams. So if you look at my background, it's been in tech. I've worked at some larger tech companies like eBay and Google and now Shopify, but also some smaller startups like ScribbleLive, PX, and OANDA. And mostly throughout my career, I've been doing talks on either analytics or growth or product. And this is actually the first time that I've talked about, or am talking about, the people side of things, which I feel like it's clearly a big part of how you can grow a product, but we don't necessarily talk about it very much. It's a little bit touchy-feely. It's actually hard to, I think, concretely put a framework around it. So what I'm about to share is kind of how I have been thinking about growing teams. It's not a Shopify-specific thing or actually any one specific thing. It's just an accumulation of my thoughts over the years from these various companies, and how you might want to look at approaching how you want to grow and develop teams. So to start, how I feel like most people just naturally think about growing teams is kind of straightforward, right? You come up essentially with an idea of the product that you want to be building, or with your existing product, an idea of how you want to be expanding it, whether it's into new markets or into a new area, or actually just maybe addressing a few bugs. From there, you kind of take a look around at your team, right? You say, given that I want to do this thing, do I have enough resources? Do I have the right talent to be actually developing this? Do I have the knowledge and expertise inside my team? And if you don't, the natural thing is to find where you either hire, raise money in order to be able to hire, or pull from another team within the company, make a business case. And then from there, I think once you have the team together, the natural thing is you do a kickoff. You try to align everybody against this goal that you've decided to go on. And this is where you might start doing something like what we have in the back of the wall here today, which is align everyone on how you think it should be developing the product or culture. And then from there, jump straight into execution. You have the team, you have kind of the goals and boundaries in place. Let's start executing and see where we go from there. And roughly, what it amounts to is what I see as kind of like a linear team formation, kind of few steps, right? From idea to people to aligning and executing. After you've done this a few times, what I naturally see people do is you start looking at each of these steps and seeing, okay, how can I do each of them better? Like what kind of framework or thinking can I put against these areas to refine what I'm doing? So what I'm about to share is in each of these buckets, what I personally found as my favorite things to look at, actually books mostly, to help you do each of these steps. So in the idea phase, I don't know if any of these are surprises to people. Has anyone not heard or seen any of these books? So the 4 steps to the epiphany of the lean startup are actually really very closely tied to basically the lean development movement. It's about the whole idea that if you want to pick a good business idea or good product, you need to validate it. And the script book, which actually came out of Google, talks about how you can do essentially the same thing, but in 5 days. So it's a very rapid ideation and getting your customers to validate for you the idea that you want to pick out before you actually really act on it. So clearly, I mean, 3 books, I'm not going to cover all of them here, but I've found consistently that these ones, when I do recommend them to people, especially people who are newer to the industry, get a lot of thoughts. So these are ones that I would recommend you take a look at if you haven't seen. So from there, people, this is a category that I think there's a lot to dig into. So 4 of my favorites. One is the Who book, which is actually about if you were to hire, what type of process do you actually use to make sure you find the people that are best fit for your team. So it's about creating a scorecard for specifically what you want to be hiring for, and then going through kind of a set interview process to make sure that you're getting the people that you want. The big recommendation out of that book that I love is actually the threat of a reference check inside an interview. So the whole idea is when you're interviewing, you ask that person what would happen if you went to their current boss and asked that boss what their weaknesses are. So it's a little bit different than asking, well, what are your weaknesses? It's kind of getting this threat of somebody else, like a third party, that you actually could tomorrow phone up and verify that the person is. So that's 2. 5 dysfunctions of a team is actually about once you've hired all these people in and you actually want to build a team, what you want to be looking at. So there's essentially a 5-step framework that they talk about, of which the key foundation is having trust onto your team. I won't go through all the steps, but once you have that together, the 2 things that I feel like you need to look at then is how your team is able to give each other feedback, which is what Radical Candor is all about. It's how to be able to give actionable and direct feedback without being an asshole about it. And then mindset is something that I'm really big on. It's about making sure that every single person on your team having a mindset for growth. So it's recognizing the potential in everybody to be able to be doing more than what they are currently doing, and having the team recognize that as well, so that you're building on each other's strengths. So from there, onto alignment. And I actually don't have one, well, I do have one specific book, but a story that I love to tell on this one. I'm sure you guys all know him, Elon Musk. There's this great story with him and actually this guy. Does anyone know who this guy might be? He's the CEO of HubSpot, Dharmesh Shah. If you go online, he has a great story about one time when he was having dinner with Elon Musk. And he is a big Elon fan. So when he sat beside Elon, he's like, oh my gosh, I'm sitting beside Elon, I have to ask him a great question. So he asks him this one question, which is, how do you build great companies? Like, what do you do with great companies? And Elon just gives him this one-line answer. This one line is this: every person on the team is a vector. Your progress is determined by the sum of all vectors. And that's it. He doesn't say anything more. So Dharmesh is kind of like, okay. And then he has to move on to the next subject because he just didn't know what to say about this. If you go on, you'll see he continues the story, and then he went home and he tried to spend all night unraveling this one line. It's like, what in the world did Elon Musk mean? What is he talking about? And this he unraveled into, well, what Elon's talking about is that every person on your team has a potential impact that they can have on your project or your company based on the skills that they bring to the team. If you're, building a mobile app, let's say the intern has a potential for doing an impact of 3 because they're new. Someone who's really experienced in mobile development can have a 7. and then somebody who's kind of like doing web dev but starting to dabble into mobile, maybe you can be fine. The problem is that they're all going in different directions. If you think of vector math, it's not just the scalar, there's the direction which it's going. You can add up all of the impact and end up basically going nowhere. So the idea is, can you actually get people aligned along the same path so that the scalars actually add up? So Damesh figured this out, went back to HubSpot, and it became the single most important analogy or kind of saying that made HubSpot into the company that it is today. So I just love the story because I also find we don't talk about alignment necessarily enough. This is just such a simple way of looking at it. So going back into alignment kind of frameworks, the one thing that I have experienced a lot of, I guess maybe probably because of the Silicon Valley background, and especially being at Google, is actually using OKRs. So the one book that I do recommend there is on Radical Focus, which is a book entirely just on OKRs. And OKR stands for Objective and Key Results. So it's a framework for having your team aligned on your goals and then having metrics to measure. So that's the key results. But it's interesting that what I find is actually that one book is just very narrow. Like I actually haven't found very many other books that give you a different framework for doing this type of alignment. So outside of that, I find people just, they set their own visions and missions. You do your own onboarding of employees as they come on to try to get them aligned. You might put values up on a wall, again, like what we have here back here, or you might set up product principles. Well, I haven't myself found a really good book or framework around many of these things. So, love to hear later on if you guys, someone in the audience has found something, I would love to hear that. And then on to building, this is actually, again, another area. I actually haven't found any books that I've really on the subject. Not to say there aren't many blog posts and other writings on it, it's just that I haven't found one kind of all encompassing. And in here, it's actually a lot of the stuff that I tend to, or in the past I've done a lot of talks about. It's how do you do agile sprints? How do you set up prioritization frameworks for your team to be able to prioritize your backlog? Do you do different streams for your team? So do you have a stream for purely building up optimizations to your existing product, or building new products in terms of minimum viable products, or doing addressing tech debt or bugs? Or do you have something like assassins? I just love that term in terms of having a team of people that's meant to kill the products that don't. So a lot of times, although you add to products, you hardly ever kill. And then another thing that I often find is overlooked, it's tying goals to your performance. So when you do have a lot of these goals set, is that actually related to, from an HR perspective, to how you manage performance inside? So with all of those things said, here's some points that I have under each of these 4 components. The question then becomes, is this enough? I mean, on its own, it's a lot already. But what I find is that typically this actually never is enough. Again, there are 2 other books that actually talk about this entire process and what's wrong with it that I really like, and that's Creativity and Inspire. So Creativity is from Ed Catmull. And when he talks about Pixar and how they do creativity, the one quote from that book that sticks with me is this one, and that's the fact that having a good team is more important than having a good idea. So if you think about that framework that we have, a lot of us tend to overlook that one people area and we kind of jump across. What it means is that we end up focusing way too much on what that one business idea is in terms of trying to find product market fit, trying to find ideas on what to build, and not enough on the actual people that are building. So that whole book goes into if you have the right team, then the ideas will actually come, and how you can build a culture. The second thing, which is actually from the book Inspired, the author there goes into talking about how the fact that this whole process is mostly linear is a problem. What I tend to see most inside the industry is that when we want to optimize this whole thing, you tend to look at the last two pieces and you iterate from them. Right? You've executed something, maybe the team isn't aligned, you go back to aligning them onto a new thing, onto something that you pivot to, and then you go and execute. Hardly everyone goes back necessarily to look at the people or even farther back into that idea and look at it essentially more like this, as a holistic cycle. So Inspired talks about that, which I really like. But my personal spin on all of this, the question is, what exactly are you building when you have a cycle like this? What do you term this? I don't know if it's a cop-out because I think we all know how important this is, but really what I think it is culture. So the question that I would have for all of you as you are looking to build out your teams is how often do you see culture as something that you develop over time? The question is, turn back and look at a wall like that on behavioral cultures that Quick has. Once you've painted it on the wall, how often do you repaint this thing? So something that my team at Shopify really holds on to that I'm really, really proud of is the fact that we believe that every single person on the team influences culture, and our everyday actions and interactions make up our culture, and that the walls do need to be repainted actually very often, because we all own a piece of that. So with that, what I want to kind of dig into a little bit more before we end the talk is a few of the things that I feel like have been missing in the large companies and even small companies I've been at in terms of how we develop culture. It's 4 things. Inclusion, which given WTO and I think just our current climate, it's top of mind I think for a lot of us. But then there's also commitment, scale, and identity, and I'll get into all of these. So on the inclusion side, first thing I want to mention is your customers. What do I mean by this? Well, when I think back to my own experiences, I've come to realize that a lot of times the company culture that the employees believed they built themselves and was their own actually wasn't their own. It was their customers that dictated a huge part of it. When I was at eBay, there was a really big culture in just buying and selling things on eBay, but eBay was, because eBay started off as a collectibles platform, there was a huge culture I think that was related to collecting things. I came across a lot of employees who collected this or collected that, people who wanted bike parts because they were fixing up bikes. Our office itself, all of the different rooms were on different collectibles. We had the Pez dispenser room versus this rubber duck room that people collected paraphernalia on. And yeah, looking back on it, I think everyone was thinking, this is an employee thing, but I don't really think it's an employee thing so much as our customers. When I was at 500px, it was the same thing. Our customer base was pro photographers who really valued creativity because they were, first and foremost, artists. And that bled into our internal culture. We value creativity as a result. And where I do feel like sometimes companies fall short is when they actually don't recognize that fact. And kind of try to cut this, or don't talk, or they don't stay close enough to the customer to actually really know what the customers value, and then they start essentially developing a culture in absence of that. So this is one thing I definitely encourage everyone here to think about. The second point on inclusion is actually looking at the different disciplines that are on your team. have an 8-step product growth framework that's on my blog if you want to check it out. This slide is actually from there. And the comment really is to make sure that when you're building up teams that you don't prop up any one specific function and make sure that you have what I call the minimum viable team, which is representation from all of these disciplines that I have listed. Which you then could say, oh, like if I just have an infrastructure project, do I really need all of these voices? Do I really need to have a team around all of this? My answer ends up typically being yes. It's not necessarily having a dedicated person, it could be a shared resource, but it's just making sure that you have that voice. Because most of the times that where I've seen teams fail is when you're lacking one of these voices at the team. And relating to that is when you have all of these voices, it's making sure that not one discipline calls all the shots. So I look around at all the different companies, there tends to be an attachment to one discipline for that company. Like Google is a very engineering-driven company. The engineers do tend to call the shots. Facebook I would characterize as a data-driven company. Airbnb I would say is more like a design one. But if I even do look at all these large companies that have been very successful, the key characteristic is that even if they have one discipline that might be stronger than another or that they identify with, the other disciplines aren't weak either. It's not to say that the engineers really just make every single decision. It's that they allow the teams to really have a voice and a say in the decisions that go on. And I think or a lot of my life, especially as a GM now, is actually managing the tension between these disciplines. Right? It's when you're making product decisions, are you listening to the data folks or are you trying to listen to the creative folks who are trying to use different data points, say, for their decision? So my answer usually tends to be, make sure everyone has a say. Maybe they all don't have a vote, but at least allow them that voice, because otherwise you're kind of losing out on the diversity. The other large thing with inclusion is committing to each other. So I find a lot of companies, when you're building out teams especially, and when you're hiring, you find people who want or are bought into the company's mission. But the Shopify company mission that I personally buy into a lot, it's to make commerce better for everyone. And it's easy, I think, when we go out there to say, okay, do you care about entrepreneurship? What does this mean to you? And I think a lot of companies do that as just a basic litmus test. When employees then come in, I think where a lot of companies fail is that they don't actually look at whether that employee is also committed to each other. Is the team actually looking at each other in the eye and saying, yes, we've got this mission that we're all bought into, but we're also bought into building this out with each other. My husband has another startup in Toronto. It's called Multi. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. But he built it from scratch up to, I think they're almost over 200 people now. And if I look at their success, it's purely, honestly, the fact that the co-founders were committed to doing this together for an extended period of time. It's actually less about their individual commitment to the actual mission. Not to say that they're not committed, but when we talk about Rob, I think it's really the team pulling together. It's just something that I would say is a little often overlooked. So the other thing that I find with cultures, a lot of teams don't design it, companies don't design it to scale. So it's like once you set a specific culture and have the disciplines set up, what happens when you kind of double the number of people that you have in your teams, or double again and triple again? And I've been thinking about this a lot because clearly Shopify has been growing like crazy. And how do you, when you're adding all these people, make sure that the culture can include all the people that are coming in? So one thing that I found that's really important is actually calling out that as you grow on the teams, each person that you add, by definition, means that the remaining team needs to get a little bit more, but the individuals in the remaining team need to get a little bit more focused in their own roles. So So the example that I have here, if you're starting a startup and you have one designer, that designer has to do everything. They have to do the UX research, they have to do the UI, they have to do the UX, they have to be the person for design. They maybe have to do with brand as well as the product. When you add in another person, you start defining the roles a little differently. Maybe you hire the person specifically for the UI, and then there's a split between UI and UX. As this kind of keeps on growing, the common mistake that I find is that a lot of companies actually don't end up with a split. They just add more designers, more designers, more designers. And one day you start realizing that without the specialty, you're actually not growing the entire craft within the company. So at some point, maybe you will get to the size that Shopify's at. And within Shopify, the design teams, we actually have a split between design, research, and then front-end development, as well as, I think we're getting there, design ops. So it's just essentially planning out your different roles to make sure that what you have can scale. Then the last piece I want to touch on is team name and identity. When I was at Google, one of the things that stuck out with me is how, when you're in a company of like 20,000 plus people, how much it matters to have an identity within your immediate team. And I mean, like, by immediate team, that's what we need 10 to 20 people. Because when you have 20,000 plus coworkers, it's really easy to get lost. And it's hard to then identify with just the one overall company brand, whether that is just eBay or just eBay. So I had a team there where we essentially created our own logo, our internal logo for the team, and a mascot. We called ourselves the Meerkats, and we had meerkat memes almost in every other meeting. And the way the meerkats, I don't know if anyone knows, actually, I don't come across many people who know about meerkats and how they act in the wild. But they have interesting group dynamics that we as a team kind of took on in ascribing to them, how they basically look out for each other. When there's danger, then one meerkat makes a call and everyone kind of comes to the rescue. And looking back at having, it sounds silly because meerkats is very silly, but looking back, it's probably one of the largest learnings I had coming out of Google was the importance of having that kind of smaller standard of team culture set. The other thing I wanted to make a comment on is essentially team name. So a while back, in my own experience, all while building product, there was a team that was given a specific name when I was at 500PX to work on a very kind of narrow part of the product. So we called it kind of the critiques team. It was to build out this critiquing functionality for photographers. And rolling forward, what I realized that it's because we called that team the one feature that they were building on, it boxed them in to that one feature. So as time moved on, even when we're thinking about other features that we could add that this team could handle, they decided not to take it on because their name wasn't all-encompassing of that thing. So the lesson that I learned from that one is, a lot of us, I think, tend to think, oh, what's in the name? We'll just name this team something based on what they're working on now. But my urge to you would be to think more broadly in terms of what this team could be doing in the future and making sure that it doesn't actually box them into any more things. You want to be able, ideally, you want them to be able to go beyond what they're at. That's essentially my list of things that I've come across. I'll leave you with this diagram of how I've seen or how I see culture being developed. Thank you. Questions now?
Hello. You mentioned during the execution portion of your talk that you were surprised that there was not one book that could easily sum up how to execute for a team. Why were you so surprised, considering that devs can work across a wide variety of tasks and products and systems, and sometimes it's going to work with Agile, or sometimes it's going to work with Scrum or Lean, or none of those. So why were you so surprised that there was no one book that could explain that?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm surprised, but I don't know if it's surprised so much as I wish there was something that I really love that wasn't. I think it's a more common of I wish. Or I also have this feeling that maybe I haven't dug enough in that area, and maybe there is one thing out there that I haven't come across. So it's almost like a hope someone here wants to surface something that they feel like it's good. But I definitely hear you, and it is very broad. So I find it hard to imagine what a book would be too.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
That was a great talk, thank you.
Oh, thanks.
So one thing that really struck me, I've worked at several tech startups and they've done the culture thing on the wall, and no one's ever changed it. Just stays there till the end of time. It's up there. It's like this is the mantra you live and breathe. No one even thinks to change what's on the precious wall. I love your thing about it being ever changing and it's fluid. So the companies you've been at, have they actually changed the wall? And what sort of conversations had to take place for people to have the foresight to change the wall?
Yeah, I think it's actually, first and foremost, just the recognition of the fact that you believe the people inside your building can influence what is on that wall, versus you hire for people who nod at your wall and will stay nodding forever. And I could tell you this, in the startups that I've been, I've debated this with executives, with CEOs who don't actually ascribe to that. And it was really tough because I definitely think of it as a more dynamic thing. So I've butt heads with people on this for sure, and kind of come away actually not winning some of these battles. Because there is definitely a school of thought that it is or should be fixed. You just hire people you assimilate, right? It's a very Borg-like thing. Assimilate the people to this culture. And I think you can approach it that way. But it's definitely not something I ascribe to, and it's not something I would fit in personally.
Hi. Yeah. Hi. Thank you for the talk. So you mentioned, so you actually want to have a minimal viable team to have different voices. So you also mentioned in terms of being a GM, and you're right now focusing on how to manage those tension across different voices. So can you share a little experience on that part, how you manage those tensions and who actually calls the big shots?
Well, my saying about that actually specifically about the creative versus data side of things, data for me only ever gets you to a local optimum. It's like we're trying to optimize things that gets you to the local. If you want to get to some global maximum, you have to break out of that and do some sort of creative thinking. If that makes sense. It's the idea between using data to iterate on whatever product or process you already have and trying to optimize that, versus creating a whole new product or a whole new process creatively, and that totally just changes all the rules, and the data you have is kind of obsolete. It doesn't matter. So when I was ran a lot of experiments, I was working with their marketing team, and there were a lot of variants of a lot of things. Our emails have many, many variants, millions in fact. And you can imagine the landing page landing pages, products that we had, there was a lot of A/B testing that was going on. So the tension always was, okay, with our existing products, we have a ton of infrastructure and data already. Do we just listen to what the data is telling us and what our users are telling us within that framework? Or do we get out of this bound and do something more creative that then breaks the mold for all of us? I don't know if necessarily I have a rubrics for the decisions there, but usually when I talk about even just this high level kind of thinking between the local versus the global, it's enough to start the conversation of how much time do you want to spend in each one? Typically, as a product manager, you end up dividing your time so that there is a portion of the entire team's development time that is set for something that is more just on that local optimization, and then the other one is more higher risk taking, more creative. But it's up to your product manager or your team really to divvy up the amount of time. It's really just risk tolerance. The team that I was on at Google at that point, we designated 25% of our resourcing budget and time to pure experiments that were meant to kind of help us break out of the existing.
So after studying all the cultures and like having to basically updating the cultures, like how do you make sure that culture is embedded within the employees without micromanaging everything?
What do you mean by the micromanaging?
Like basically saying like, oh, like this is our culture, like make sure you have this in your mind without going to everyone and saying that. Like how can we make sure that everyone's on the same page with the cultures?
I don't think you ever get to 100% about that, and I do feel like there's no shortcuts with that either. I do feel like when you have a set culture or a set of values, you do have to over-communicate on it. It's not saying, well, it's like if you don't say it 7 times, then I'm really heard you. I find this is one of those things where you need it more than 7 times for somebody to actually have heard you. I've tried this many times where I say it to the team, I ask them the next week, it's like, what did I say? And it's not like they weren't listening, it's just take any one thing that you say to a bunch of people and expect them to remember it within a week. It's not easy. So my recommendation would actually be to try to over-communicate on that and hopefully. But then at the same time, it's also, as you tell them, let them know that they are bought into this process, or they have a say in what that is. Because over the years, as you're executing, as you're adding different people, you are finding that what is on the wall doesn't resonate anymore, changing. I've definitely done that. It requires more pain, but it's worth it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.